No one else has worked on this site before, so it's important new information and interpretations of the battle that he's contributed. Tim Abel told me about, Tim Abel's here too now, was spoken here at the conference. He highly recommended Paul as a speaker. And then my brother-in-law, Chris Rotano, was here, raved about Paul's programs and told me I had to get this guy. So he's a great brother-in-law, so I got to do what he says. Right. So, whole family's here. My brother's here today too. We're sharing a room upstairs for the first time since probably high school. So Paul used to attend our conferences. I didn't really remember him because he didn't speak. The other day he told me this. I really wondered because he was very nervous about speaking before such a prestigious group of speakers and a distinguished audience here in Oswego. But I told him to relax and dress casually. Trust me, they'll go easy on you. So and here's Paul Beers. So like they say in the old students routine, give him the works.
Here. And good morning again. My name is Paul Beers, for those who don't know me. And this stuff, as far as being an archaeologist, it's amateur, of course. I had no intention of ever being one. This all started about 7 years ago when I found my first cannon shot on the Cranberry Creek. And I just with wanting more knowledge, I just kept finding it and wanted to find out more about the battle. I've always been interested in it since high school. I went to high school in Alexandria Bay. Can everybody hear me? Okay. And I never, in all my dreams, ever thought I'd be standing here today and giving other presentations other places and end up writing a book on it. However, first, before we get started on the presentation, I would like to thank Paul here and the Friends of Fort Ontario for having me here today to present to you my research on the Battle of Cranberry Creek, or as the British refer to it, the Battle of Goose Creek. It is, with the amount of material I have uncovered on the battle, and as Paul said, there has been no American documentation on this battle up to the point that appears that up to the point that I started researching it. The time allotment here, I'm limiting the presentation to just the American capture of the British supplies, British supply convoy laying over at Simmons Landing, and the British attempt to regain those supplies. And you will notice here that the name of my presentation is the attack on Fort Pork Barrel, and the Fort Pork Barrel is the name given to the temporary fort erected at Cranberry Creek by the website NorthAmericanForts.com. And it'll be almost apparent later on in the presentation why it was called that. At the present time, I've uncovered no hard evidence of how this affair all is. I'm not sure. Never done this before. How this affair all started, but the historical accounts state that a Major Jehiel Dimmick of the New York militia, who at the time was attached to Forsyth Rifles, and Captain Samuel Dixon, ship's master of the Neptune, learned of a British supply convoy that would be taking British supplies to Kingston from Montreal. And so they set about organizing and recruiting 43 volunteers for an expedition downriver to relieve the British of those supplies. So on the evening of July 14th, and it was in the evening because they wanted to be the advance totally undetected, they would set out for a 3-day trip to Goose Bay and Cranberry Creek. They first stopped at Cape, whoops, I gotta go back here. They first stopped at Cape Vincent, and then the next day they proceeded on, or the next evening they proceeded on to French Creek, and on the morning of the 17th they arrived in Goose Bay. Upon their arrival in Goose Bay, before going to their campsite, they sent out scouts in 2 small boats, which they had brought with them to locate and wait for the arrival of the convoy, which they knew was coming from Prescott. And then they set, after the scouts were deployed, they then went into Cranberry Creek, all the way up to the head of the creek and where the road was, and set up camp. Now this is an 1812 map. The star here is where they set up camp, and the blue arrow indicates the road that was there in 1812. Today, this road is called the Swan Hollow Road. It comes out of Alexandria Bay. The blue star is where the memorial grave sites are located at Cranberry Creek today. Now, it was by no happenstance that Cranberry Creek was well chosen in advance, primarily due to the location of the road, which we will see will be a major factor in the success of this campaign. Oh, geez. Sorry about that. Now, it has been well done, and the reason that they chose Cranberry Creek here is not only for the road, but its proximity to Rockport, which is right up here, directly across the river from Goose Bay. Now, being well documented that this the convoy was captured at Simmons Landing, my first challenge was to find Simmons Landing. I could not locate it on any map. It's not in any text or any references that I could find anywhere except that relates to this one instance. So I ended up going to Rockport and talking with several of the older residents there, who all said they had heard of it but didn't know its location. So by the end of the day, the only thing I came away with was I needed to go to Brockville to search the land records there to come up with some kind of an answer. Upon going to, I made a couple other trips to Brockville, searching the land records, and I came up with a strong candidate, who was Caleb Seaman. Now, Caleb was granted Lot 8 in Rockport in 1799. Today, Lot 8 in Rockport is the location of Ed Huck Marina. And this is Lot 8 right here. And as you can see, this is Ed Huck's Marina today. And it was granted to Caleb Seaman in 1799 by King George. Now, this presented another question. Why is it still called Simmons Landing? And I said, in doing some more research, I looked into Caleb's land grants from the Canadian Archives, and I found he had 2 land grants, one for Lot 8, and inside those land grants there were statements that said he was all called Simmons. I said, oh, okay, there's an aha moment. So now I've got him finding Simmons. Now I've got to find out, how did Seaman get to Simmons? And why is he called Simmons? Well, I would find out that Simmons is the Dutch pronunciation of seaman. Now, Caleb Seaman came to Canada as a loyalist from the heavily Dutch settlement around Albany with the other loyalists after the Revolutionary War. So he was commonly called Seaman. So now that ends all that. That's how we finally come across to finding Simmons Landing. Now, the day on the 17th, the afternoon of the 17th, the convoy found, the scouts found the convoy laying over at Simmons Landing for the evening, and it is apparent, it seems like it was, Simmons Landing was the common stop for the convoys between Prescott and Kingston because it's almost exactly halfway. And upon the scouts finding out, they returned to Cranberry Creek, reporting to Dimmick and Dixon of their location and that they had found it. And then Dimmick and Dixon and the other officers made a plan to attack to get the convoy in the early morning hours while everybody was asleep. Oh. Corey didn't have this trouble. So in the early morning hours of the 18th, the attack commenced. Lieutenant Perry, along with Sergeant James, landed to cut off any retreat of the Captain Dixon Burbank, capturing the boats. So coordinated was the surprise that all the 15 bateau and the gunboat Spitfire was all captured without a single shot being fired, according to the historical documents. Now, however, a few of the British crew members did manage to escape. After the capture, the Americans managed to take control of all the 15 bateau and their supplies, which consisted of 270 barrels of salt pork or beef, 279 barrels of pilot bread, and the gunboat Spitfire with her carronade and a large number of military supplies. Now, the Spitfire, again, was like Simmons Landing. The only documentation I've ever been able to find, and still have been able to find on the Spitfire, only relates to this one instance. I can't find where she was made, who her captain was, or anything. I've looked through almost everything. Malcolmson doesn't have it, so pretty much this is the only instances you'll find where the Spitfire is named. So after getting all the boats and prisoners together and organized, Dimmick and Dixon retreated to Goose Bay, and however, they were not alone. There was some person or persons had the forethought to follow them in a boat, and they followed them all the way to Goose Bay, observing them entering the mouth of the creek, and then reported back to Rockport, reporting their location, at which time the messages were sent both to Kingston and to Prescott to alert the troops that there was a capture of the convoy and where the Americans were holed up. Sorry, guys, no. Fingers must be too big here. Okay, let's see if we can do this. Okay, after the Americans entered the creek, they, I indicated for here on this site that the site of the battle, and as you'll see as we progress, it's almost exactly halfway between the mouth of the creek and where their campsite was down here. So once back in the creek, the Americans immediately sent word to General Jacob Brown by messenger on horseback, requesting reinforcements and the success of the mission in requesting reinforcements be sent there to help protect them. Right after that, 69 prisoners were rounded up and sent for a trip to Sackett's Harbor, and they would be under armed guard of 15 troops under the command of Lieutenants Burbank and Perry. And this is the route they would have taken, and it is documented. They left Cranberry Creek, they bypassed Theresa, they went down into Evans Mills, into Watertown, and then on to Sackett's Harbor from there. Both Dimmick and Dixon, back up for 1 second. After the 15 had left, if we remember, there was 43 volunteers. Dimmick and Dixon left 45, so the records, the historical records say there were 30 members present, which we will confirm later. Both Dimmick and Dixon knew that the British would be furious over the loss of this large supply convoy going to Kingston with the much needed supplies, and they would be coming to reclaim their property. With the remaining men at the campsite, they started to talk about and set up some primary defenses. In setting up these primary defenses, there is no documentation. We can only deduce what was done. When transversing the creek, they found this area that's halfway up the creek where it takes its first right-hand turn. Now this is the most, probably one of the most important parts of the strategy. And they decided they would station their boats there. And this creek it took the first right-hand, was narrow, and with a couple of quick turns right here, which made it perfect. The other part, there was a 20-foot cliff here with wooded background in there for musket support from the American forces. And there was a marsh on the right-hand side, all this preventing the British from exiting their boats. In addition to that, they felled some trees and put some brush across the creek where they preventing the British from coming any further toward their campsite. The news arrived in Kingston and either late in the day on the 18th or early on the 19th of July. Upon receiving this news, prompted Sir James Yeo to dispatch immediate action to reclaim those supplies. According to the logbook of Yeo's ship, the HMS Wolf, for July 19, 1813, it states, PM, the two gunboats with Lieutenant Scott and Johnstone sent on an expedition downriver. Their orders were to go around the west side of Wolf Island and search the south shore in the bays and to prevent the enemy from going that way. That distance is about 35 miles. Also, lacking any documentation, Martin left Kingston, and it's not lacking the documentation, it's unclear when he left Kingston, but Captain Martin and his regiment of his detachment of the 100th left Kingston, and their orders were to prevent the Americans from sneaking by the north channel of the Wolf Island and to meet up with Scott and Johnstone on the foot of Wolf Island. On July 20th, after leaving meeting up and leaving the foot of Wolf Island, they moved on down the south shore of the river, checking the bays and stuff for the Americans. And late in the afternoon, they arrived at Goose Bay, and it was too late in the afternoon to take any action against the American forces. So they set up camp on the shores of Goose Bay, sending out some scouts. But due to the lateness in the day, the scouts could not do a thorough scouting job, and that'll be evidence later on. Now, in the meantime, Major Fenn from Prescott was organizing his detachment of the 41st Regiment of Foot to come to Goose Bay. Now, the distance between Kingston and Prescott is 65, 66 miles, so there was no communication, and he would not know that anybody was already there. But he left Prescott on the day of the 20th also, and that was confirmed by a letter from, let's see, where am I here? From Joseph Ross Seal to, oh, come on here. From Joseph Ross Seal, who was in Ogdensburg at the time, to David Parrish, saying that about 40 some gunboats assembled with some two-masted gunships to ascended the creek today. Now, if you stop and think of it, that's a significant force. Just to assume that in these gunboats, if there's only 10 troops, that's 400 right off the bat. Don't know how accurate these accounts are, but that's it. Now, Major Fenn and his detachment had a little harder trouble getting to Goose Bay because he would be rowing upriver and against the current. And also there was according to the logbook of the Wolf, on that day in Kingston, the winds were light breezes, which is between 4 and 7 miles an hour. And most likely were contrary, so they would have been blowing from the, come on here, would have been blowing from the east to the west. But anyway, Major Fenn arrived later that evening, and he stated that on arrival to the entrance of that creek in the dusk of the evening, he discovered gunboats on shore from the officers of the Navy and a body of sailors and a detachment of His Majesty's 100th under command of Major Martin, which also seemed to surprise him a little because, like I said, there was no communication between Kingston and Prescott quickly. Now while all this was going on, the Americans were also receiving reinforcements to protect what had been captured. On July 20th, Captain John Hoover of the New York militia and living in Theresa area at the time, Theresa, New York area at the time, stated he received an order from General Jacob Brown to proceed without delay with his company to a point on the St. Lawrence River, known then by the name of Cranberry Creek, for the purpose of protecting and defending a quantity of military stores which had been captured from the enemy in the Canada waters. With 55 of his men, that's Hoover's, he arrived at the spot that same evening, and that he found Colonel Dixon, which was Captain Dixon, and Major Dimmick there with about 30 men. So now we have a documentation that the original count was accurate, 45 leaving with 15 going back to Sackett's Harbor, leaving 30, so that documents that. However, sometime after Hoover's arrival, and we know that it was after because Hoover stated there's only 30 men present, that a detachment under of the U.S. 25th from Sackett's Harbor arrived at Cranberry Creek under the command of Lieutenant Thomas M. Reed. In the affidavit of John Irwin, who was documented as being at the battle, he stated that despondent was set under the command of Lieutenant Reed to set Cranberry Creek to aid in securing and the boats and provisions so taken by Captain Dimmick. So if we add up all the people that were present at this time, we have 30 that were there, 55 of Hoover's. We don't know how many of Reed's men were there. Assume it was 10 or 15, so we have in the neighborhood of 100 American forces at Cranberry Creek prior to the battle, as opposed to the historical count of only 30. Upon taking command of the land troops, Hoover immediately started setting up the temporary fort. He had his men unload the boats with the barrels of pork and beef and biscuits and form a breastwork, and it was at this point here, and we'll see the location of this, which is pretty much indicated where it was. After the fort was set up, Hoover then ordered his men to take their defensive positions in the woods and wait for his signal, which would be an Indian whoop, for his outpost to come in, which was at daybreak the next morning when the enemy appeared. Upon Major Fenn's arrival at the entrance of the creek, he was surprised. He did seem surprised to find Captain Martin there. But however, being the senior officer, he assumed command of the whole units, and sent out more scouts. However, the only thing the scouts could determine that the Americans had moved their camp further up the street, up the creek. I'd like to point out this time that the Americans were never camped out at the mouth of the creek. If we look at the map here, and I don't think much has changed in a couple hundred, this is all marsh. And it's marsh up to this point right here. This is all marsh in through here. And it's all marsh. This is Route 12 going to Ogdensburg. And it's all marsh right to that route, basically. There's no good campsites at all right there. And so this is where I indicated the British. This was the only place the British could camp. But there would be no place for the Americans to camp until they got down in this area here. And there is no suitable campgrounds along in here. It's all wooded and hilly until you get down to where the road is, where the end of the creek, the head of the creek is at the road. Okay, now we come to the day of the battle, which is July 21st, 1813. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Major Fenn, with about 200 to 250 troops, 4 gunboats, and 2 small, and 2 smaller gunboats, proceeded up the creek in hopes of gaining the enemy positions by the dawn of day. Major Fenn's detachment rode up the creek until it became too narrow, and they had to pole the rest of the way until their further progress was impeded by large trees that were felled across the stream. Major's defense, at what point, and we can see now the strategy that Dimmock and Dixon had, I'm not sure this is how it went, but the creek's not wide enough for the gunboats of the day to have two wide in them, and this area here wasn't wide enough to have 2 gunboats in it either. Now to show you what it looked like in that area, I'm standing on top of that 20-foot cliff. This is my perception of the way the would have looked, indicated by the felled tree there. American gunboat number 1 is here, number 2 is there, and I suspect that's where B we'll see earlier. So that gunboats number 2's field of fire would not interfere with the American gunboat number 1. Now, as the British was looking at this, this is what they would have seen. It doesn't appear it, but it is pretty steep. It's very difficult to climb, and as you can see, it is wooded, but being a rocky ridge and stuff like that, there is no dense undergrowth up there. And there is a fairly natural trail that goes through the woods. Now, from here on out, the remaining part of my presentation, which the slides show the location of the found artifacts. I have to give credit to Dr. Tim Abel on this one, who strongly recommended I get a GPS unit and document their locations, and further suggested I get a GIS program to plot those things. Had I not followed his advice, I would not be here today. So thank you again, Doc. In the diminished light of the dawn, the American gunboats hiding around the bend, here and here, I've just arbitrarily assumed that this was the Neptune, and I based that on the fact that Major Dimmick was in command of the Fox, and I'm assuming that he would want to be in a position to get back to the fort, which is just down here, so should things turn south for the Americans. And that's the only assumption that I've got. The Fox could have well been there, but anyway, this is American gunboat number 1 and number 2. And while the British were dismantling the barricade, the trees and stuff like that, the Americans opened fire on it here. And with supporting fire from the woods, the Americans in the woods were hiding behind these 2 ridges right here and shooting down into the creek. And as you can see, the American gunboat number 1, the British were definitely trapped. There was absolutely no way to go. They couldn't exit their boats. And this is pretty much the area of American fire. There was 1 cannon shot up in here. We'll talk about that later. The only documented boat that other than the Neptune, the only documented British boat I can document as being at the battle was the Brock, and that comes from it's Captain John Carr of the militia, the Upper Canadian Militia, and he, on his account of the battle, and he documented it as being the last boat in line, and we do know that 1 person was killed in his boat, so there had to be more shot in that, and I said we will cover that later. Now, of the 2 smaller gunboats that entered the creek along with it and trying to dismantle them, 1 of them was reported as being sunk. So with the use of side scanning technology, sonar technology, a sunken boat was located. Wow. The sonar image here shows a sunken boat that is believed to be one of the 2 smaller boats. The upper left-hand corner is pointing to the area of the initial engagement where this was located. And the boat itself is 18 feet long and 4 feet wide, which is about right for a small bateau. And the white part coming off here could possibly be a sailing mast. Who knows, you know. The only other documentation I can show you, and I don't know how well you can see this, this is taken at boat level where it was located, and there is a shadow, a boat-shaped shadow right here. It's different brown right here as compared to over here. It wasn't a good shot, but it's definitely there. The photo is better. But unfortunately, this is a DEC wetlands area, and this is the only proof that you're ever going to have on it. I wouldn't live long enough to get any permits to do anything different. So, however, the important part of the trap that they had was that the British gunboats were unable, due to their position, return fire on the American gunboats. As you can see, as they're lined up, they're not in position to be firing at the American gunboats. However, they were in position to fire at the land forces, the American land forces, as indicated here. Now, if you remember back in the previous slide, all the recovered shot was up in here, and there was nothing between here and here, except this one little lead fragment. So I got to assume that these lines of fire are relatively accurate based on the recovered shot. Now, this shot either came from the second or third gunboat. It is my opinion that it was the second gunboat because the size of the gunboats, two would not fit in here. And one could have been behind them, but I think they would have been blocked by the second gunboat. Now, the first gunboat was in a position to fire down the shoreline to the area where the fort was. And as we see here, this is where I'd indicated earlier that I suspect the fort was. And as you can see, it fired down here, and pretty much the lines of fire go down. Now, this area in here of the shot we'll talk about a little later on, but as you can see here, they had a pretty good idea where the fort was. Even this distance between here and here is approximately 1,500 feet. Wooded, and there's no way they could have seen where the cannon shot was coming from. It is my suspicion that they simply fired where they heard the sound and saw the smoke from the small cannon that was perched on top of this hill here, and I'm pretty sure it was on top of the hill because it was on the side of the hill that I found the shot, which I assumed to be a drop. Now, this is a photo of what the woods would have looked like to the British. The British documentation said it was heavily wooded, which it is, closer to the, you get to the wood, but when you get up in the ridges there, again, you saw from the cliff picture that there's no dense undergrowth. It's easy walking, it's easy looking around in there. So, let's see this over 24. However, the British were still trapped. And they were desperately seeking a new strategy to gain the advantage on the Americans. And upon that new strategy, they finally decided on a land assault. This land assault would come under the command of Captain Fawcett and his men of the 100th Regiment of Foot, who was in the Brock at the time. They exited the Brock, accessed the right bank. He immediately found out that there were no Americans on the right bank and that they were all on the left bank. And Captain Fawcett with his men and their rifles and powder over their head crossed the creek, and with much difficulty owing to the marshy nature of the landing here, started to land on the left bank. Now, as they were landing on the left bank, they were met by a detachment from the American forces. Met a small skirmish started there. However, Fawcett finally managed to gain the land and started to push the Americans back toward the defensive position. Now, Fawcett once started pushing his advance through the Americans back. Two things why I say reasons I've indicated here. This is a natural trail through the woods at that point. We see that there's some musket balls here. The green ones I've indicated as American. The white I've indicated as British. And as you see, simply following the thing, and when they come to the top of this ridge right here, or come to this ridge, the only way you can get to the top of it is right here on the back side is a passage to the top. This is 35, 40 feet and very difficult to climb. The only other way Fawcett could have got to where the initial engagement was to come through this area right here, which is about 20 feet wide, perfectly smooth and flat through there, no brush, no trees, no nothing, but it would have been suicide for him, because if the Americans were on top of this ridge and top of that ridge, it would have been worse for him than if they were in the boat. So he proceeded on. Now, before we go any further here, I'd like to indicate how I determined the size of the, or who had what musket ball. I have made the assumption that all musket balls 60.68 caliber and above to be British, simply based on the fact that they had the 75 caliber Brown Bess, and all other smaller musket balls to be American, based on the fact that the infantry would have had the 69 caliber, and that the militia would have had the 69 caliber issued to it by, as documented, issued to it by General Brown's Armory. The possibility, I understand, exists that some of the militia may have had 75 caliber Brown Bess, but it is my estimation that with the ammunition that Brown was furnishing, it would have all been 69 caliber. Also available at that time was a 54 caliber Harpers, but I found no indication that there was one at this battle. So as Fawcett continued to push the Americans back along this natural route, again, he keeps pushing the Americans back, and we can see by the musket balls that they're firing at something. There is an American dropped musket ball right there. Now, not sure when this would have happened. It's, because they were pretty close to the boats at that time. But they did progress on, and I'm just following. Again, this is the natural trail, and we come to this point where the Americans were hiding, and we see several musket balls, and then again there's a British dropped one right there. And following the trail and going along and finding musket balls along this trail, again another dropped one, indicating that this is relatively accurate. And as you can see, this by the shading, this is pretty much on the top of a ridge going through there. As Fawcett continues on toward the fort and pushing the Americans further back, and again, following the trail and the top of the ridge, just picking up the musket balls as I'm going along, as the Americans and the British are firing at each other going back. Now, this style of fighting was not in the typical British style of fighting, of line fighting. It was a tree-to-tree thing, more of an Indian or guerrilla style fighting up here in the woods. So once inside of the fort, Fawcett moved in with his troops and formed a firing line, and I kind of indicated this firing line and the red line. This is Fawcett's most forward advance, and I indicate that because there's a dropped musket ball there, dropped one there. There's also one in here, and one back there. There's one up here. There's one there. So this is Ford's most forward advance. And as you can see by the musket balls here, that pretty much indication where the fort was. It would have probably been a little ahead of it, or maybe a little behind it, but it was in this general area where the fort was, the temporary fort was. This is where the cannon would have been, because there's the shot I found. It was on the side of this ridge here. As I said, I think it was a drop. So as the battle progressed at this point here, Due to the natural, very great natural strength of where the fort was, Fawcett was unable to, can everybody hear me? Yes. Oh, okay. Fawcett was unable to dislodge the Americans, and as you look at it here, the fort had its back to the creek. It had this little knoll up here, and this area here is all kind of swampy area down through there, making it you know, a little more difficult for the British to get around that way. So now somewhere during this battle, Fawcett somehow learned that several hundred American troops were near at hand. How he knew that, I don't know, unless the Americans were saying, hey, you'll be regretted when the recruitments get here or something. I don't know, but it is documented that I found a newspaper article that General Morgan Lewis had sent 300 dragoons to aid in, to Cranberry Creek to aid in protecting the boat and supplies captured. And also on the day of the afternoon of the 21st, when Hoover left, he made a statement in his affidavit stating that by the time he had left, that quite a significant amount of forces had arrived from Sackett's Harbor. Now, what is it quite? I don't know. Is it 300? I don't know. The newspapers of the day tended to add a little something, a little flair to their articles, so we're not sure if it was 300, but Hoover said it was quite significant. So Fawcett failing to dislodge the Americans, and at one point decided to withdraw back to the boats. And once back at the boats, they exited the creek and broke camp, disbanded, and all the factions went back to their respective home bases. Now, this slide here shows the entire shot field that I have documented. There's only a couple of cannon shot that I have not put on here because I found them after I did this. We see the area around the fort here pretty much indicates where it was. There's no place to put an X on it, but we know it was in this area here. It's not an area any bigger than this conference hall right here. Matter of fact, it's not even as big as this conference area. Now, there's 3 shot that's located here. I've looked several times behind that. I've never found anything else. So my assumption here is these were just overshot and happened to be there. But as we can see, the majority of the shot is all located in there. Now, we said earlier that wasn't sure about this. Now, I'm still not sure of when these happened. I'm suspecting that when Fawcett was up in here and the Americans were retreating down here, that somehow he had told the gunboat to fire along this range. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, or if this was done initially and they decided to raise some elevation to get back to the area of the fort. I don't know, but that's it. We have the initial British response on the American forces hiding in the woods, giving a musket fire. We have the American initial contact right here. And you'll see there's 1 canister shot up here and a couple musket balls down here. Now, the reason for this, I suspect there was a lot more in this area. I personally know of 4 other metal detectors who have several musket shot and cannon shot from the battle. And it is my suspicion that it all came from in this area right here. And come on. And I'm basing that on the fact that we don't find anything there. And the fact that if they did not get on top of this hill here, had they gotten on top of the hill there, again, I probably would not be here. All that would have been confiscated, and there'd been no record of where the shots were found or the position of them. So that's pretty much the entire shot film. As we can see, the battle just progressed right along the edge of the creek here on top of these ridges. This is all swampy area down through here. So we know that there was nothing down in there. And just as you get outside these areas, you find absolutely nothing, or I found absolutely nothing. Now, all indications are that the entire American camp had broke camp on the 23rd. Now, they waited 2 days to break camp to make sure that the British had all left. They didn't want to be drawn into a trap leaving Cranberry Creek with the British waiting for them. So they sent out a couple of scouts, and scouts reported back that everything was clear, that no British were found anywhere. So they broke camp on the 23rd, and the wounded were escorted back to Sackett's Harbor by land, and I have documentation on that, while the Fox and Neptune departed Cranberry Creek. With the Fox and Neptune, there is no documentation of their return voyage at all. The assumption being here is they simply reversed their course to go back, first stopping at French Creek and then stopping at Cape Vincent. On July 25th, in the Wolf's Log, it is stated that at 5 p.m. in the afternoon, the Earl of Moya raised anchor and left the harbor to cruise Lake Ontario and the head of the St. Lawrence to intercept the Americans should they come out during that time. And on July 27th, the Fox and Neptune left Cape Vincent and rounded Tibbetts Point, which is right there, and somewhere between Tibbetts Point and Sackett's Harbor, they encountered the Earl of Moya, who at the time is reported to have 16 guns, 14 24s and two 9s. The general, seeing how there's no records of this, I at the time ordered another 2 weeks of the Wolf's Log from the archives in hopes that there was some comment in there that of this encounter, but there wasn't. Then after that, I started looking for a logbook for the Earl of Moya. Nothing in the Canadian archives, nothing at Halifax, nothing in the American archives, and nothing in the British archives that they could find. Now, strange enough, the HMS Wolf Log is in our archives, not the Canadian ones. So why, I don't know. Anyway. Now, the general historical consensus of this, lacking the documentation, like I said, the only way we can find something is we know that the logs of the ship of the Neptune were turned over, but who knows where they are? Nobody's ever been able to find them. They're probably lost. Maybe they're in with Indiana Jones stuff at that day. Who knows? Anyway, the general historical consensus of this encounter indicates that shots were fired from the Earl of Moya when the Fox passed within a half a musket shot of her. 3 9-pound shots struck the Fox, one passing through her magazine, but didn't have any essential injury or damage to the Fox. And the Fox finally managed to outmaneuver and disengage the Earl of Moya and made it safely back to Sackett's Harbor. Now we get to the casualties of the battle. The American, surprisingly enough, due to the number of people that were involved and the amount of cannon shot and musket fire that was going on, the number killed was virtually the same. Which is amazing with all that was going on. And you got several hundred troops up in there. The American wounded I've documented to date so far, 4. I initially, at the time of this slide, have indicated 3 or 4 killed. I'm now suspecting there could be as much as 5 Americans. We'll discuss that here in a couple of minutes. And you can make up your mind on that. The British, however, suffered a lot more wounded, and this is primarily due to the fact that they were caught in their boats and under the initial attack and had no place to retreat. They were stuck, so to speak. They suffered 5 killed. 4 were killed in action and 1 was mortally wounded, which we'll talk about. Now here are the British casualties that are documented. Samuel Fry of the 41st Regiment of Foot, Daniel Watts of the 41st Regiment of Foot, Thomas Shelley of the 8th King's Regiment of Foot, and George B. of the 41st Regiment of Foot. Now Henry B. O. Milnes was the aide-de-camp to Sir George Provost. He was mortally wounded in the head in the Brock, and he is documented as being wounded in the head in the Brock. Now, he really shouldn't have been there. He was enticed by Major Fenn to go, and upon my research on Milnes, he was the type of guy that would like another camp, even though he did not have aide-de-camp, was not a frontline position of any sort. He seemed to be the type of guy that would want another campaign on his record of success, so that's why he was there. But he died of the wounds in Kingston on August 22nd. There are a couple other accounts of his death. One states he died on the 25th of August, the other states he died on the 26th. But somewhere in 22, 25, 26, he died in Kingston of the head wounds. Now, the American casualties, this is what I have to date. The wounded I've documented. The first one is Nathan Dyke. He was a private in Hoover's militia. Benjamin Christian, I'm not sure if he was in Dimmick's boat or Dixon. He was with the original volunteers, and I only state that because he was in another campaign. He was in the Battle of York with Dimmick. So I assume maybe he was with Dimmick. Amos Babcock was in Dimmick's outfit, but he wasn't there originally. He arrived on the 20th of July from Ogdensburg. Captain John Hoover is the only non-battle injury that was here. And that happened when he was unloading the boats with the barrels of pork and beef. One of the barrels, he lost his footing, it slipped, hitting him against the side of the boat, causing him a severe rupture, which he claimed he was in much severe pain and had to tightly cravat so he could not show he was in pain to his troops. His words, not mine. So that injury would affect him the rest of his entire life. Now, in all my research, has only come up with a list of possible dead. I've got no smoking gun here that said they were killed at Cranberry Creek. We kind of have to read between the lines, but it's one of those things we'll never really know for sure. The first one here is James Buchanan, and he's the only name listed in print by any historian. By any historian, and he's listed in Haddock's Growth of a Century. And according to Haddock, he is buried at the point where the Canadian gunboat was sunk, and we saw where that was. So this may indication that there was the boat that was sunk there. Early on during my research, I came across an area up there which looked real good, like a real gravesite. You know, back in the woods, it had the right shape, the right stones around it. It didn't look like it was a campfire or anything, so without touching it, I finally got a hold of Dr. Tim Abel. He came over and looked at it and said he'd like to come back and take a closer look at it, which he did, and the only thing we discovered that it was a pile of stones and some dirt, but it looked good enough to have him come back. So since then I found a couple other places up there, but again they just turned out to be piles of stone, but I continue to look every time I go up there. Now the rest of the people, the only place I could find them was in the Army Register of Enlistments in the United States Army, compiled 1798 to 1914. Now these were all written in by different people, so you have different ways that they were written in. Samuel Sumner, private in the 9th, is documented the 9th was there. In the remarks section of that register, it says return dead and disabled men to Sackett's Harbor, New York, February 1714. That would have been his normal discharge date, and that appears in a column, a couple columns to the left of the remarks section. It says died July 21st, which was the day of the battle, and it says returned dead. So maybe, you know, that's a possibility. It says see pension case. I've written the archives twice on different occasions to see if I could find it. They both times came back that there was no pension case for Samuel Sumner. Johnson Harmon, the same thing. He was in the 9th. He died on July 21st. It says at Sackett's Harbor. That would have been his duty station. That would have been his duty station. Again, the day of the battle. Now at this point in time, Hoover had left on the afternoon of the battle, which was the 21st. Upon his leaving, in his affidavit, he had stated that only 2 were killed. Okay? Now, we have 2. And whether these are the 2 or not, I don't know. However, there are 3 graves at Cranberry Creek. And the next person down, L. Nathan Bigelow, he was a private the 21st. They were there. He died at Sackett's Harbor July 22nd. Now, that's the day after the battle. He could have been at the battle and mortally wounded at the battle and died there, thus being the 3rd grave. However, again, no smoking gun. There was no other confrontations or engagements during this time. Again, he's probably the 3rd grave. I suspect these 3 are there, but that's only me. I don't know. Then we have number 5 possibly. We have Nathan Simmons. He was a private in the 9th. We know the 9th was there. It says return dead and dead men to meaning Sackett's Harbor, killed July 25th. Now, they broke camp on the 23rd, and it's at least a 2-day trip back to Sackett's Harbor from there by land in those days. Roads weren't all that great, but they were roads. He could have been mortally wounded and died en route. Again, no smoking gun. There was no other confrontation on that date with the enemy. Engagements is recorded that I could find. We have to, he has to be considered at least. I don't know. I'm leaving it up to you guys. I can't find anything on him, and that doesn't mean I haven't stopped looking. I'm waiting for fold 3 to get down to the S's, but I don't think I'll live long enough. So this concludes my presentation. Again, I would like to thank you for allowing me to share my research here with you. And for those of you who have not been back in the back to review my all the artifacts I have found from the battle, I invite you to do so. They're back at my table. And for those of you who are interested in a more complete, detailed account of the entire affair, which is a lot larger than I've been able to do here, I'm giving you a shameless plug of my book back there. So it is available for sale. And thank you again very much. And any questions? I'm sure there must be some. Back in the back. Are you talking about the ones that were not present at the time, or directly at the battle, or were assembled at Cranberry Creek at one time or another?
In the battle.
In the battle, there was supposedly 200 to 250 British and around 100 Americans.
Okay, thank you.
So that's about 300 to 350 total. Yes, ma'am.
What would the weather conditions have been like? It sounds swampy.
It is swampy.
So would there have been
in my opinion, other than a couple of areas up there, it is virtually the same as it was 200 years ago.
well, would it have been, mosquitoes and ants and no seals? And
To some degree. I've only had, let me put it this way, in all the 7 years I've been going up there, I've worn a net for a couple hours for 2 days.
Well, by July, they wouldn't be as prevalent.
There's generally a nice wind that's blowing up there, which keeps them up, but I'm sure that they're there. I just haven't been there at a time that they're pesky.
Then my other question would be, when they got back to their forts, their individual forts, could some of them have come down with something else besides bullet wounds?
Don't know. I'm not aware of any disease that was around here in that time, except for consumption or something like that. And they wouldn't have gotten that at the battle. So, other questions? Yes, sir.
The archaeological pieces that you discovered, the shop shells, what was the disposition of those? Were they removed or left in place?
They're sitting back on the table back there. They're all sitting back on the table.
So all the pieces you discovered are here?
Yes, everything that, well, with the exception of a few cannon shot that I've handed out on, I've given to the landowners that allowed me to use their property to do this. I got to tell you, this is all on private property. So the whole battle is on 2 pieces of private property. So.
Any markers?
No. I've thought about that seriously, and I'm not sure that I want it. I don't think that it
We'll have to stop questions now, all right?
Okay, I'm available in the back all day for any of those who've got more questions. And thank you very much.
Again.